Mettañca sabbalokasmi, mānasaṃ bhāvaye aparimāṇaṃ, Uddhaṃ adho tiriyañca, asambādhaṃ averamasapattaṃ. And one should develop a boundless mind that is metta for the entire world, above, below, and across, a mind that is unbound, benevolent, and friendly. So we'll notice right away here in verse 8 that we have this exact phrase that we found in verse 7, mānasaṃ bhāvaye aparimāṇaṃ. So I won't go into any more detail about that, except to say something that I should have said back in verse 7, is that the subject of bhāvaye, let one or one should, that one is, I think, the person being referred to in verse 1, this person who has discovered or has realized the path to peace. Remember, we encountered let that person be upright, etc. And so we're still talking about that same person. And by the way, that person should be everyone. So we have this same phrase here. We're talking about an unbound mind. And now that is filled out for us a little more, and that's why we have all these words in green. These are technically said to be in apposition to one another, meaning that they are describing the same thing. They're not describing separate objects. So one should develop this unlimited mind, this immeasurable mind. And what's another word for that? It is called metta. And of course, this is the name of the sutta in question. This is the sutta we are studying right now. Metta is typically defined as loving kindness, and it's related to the Pali word mitta, which means friend. In Sanskrit, it's mitra, and it's also whence comes the name Maitreya, or in Pali, Metteya, the name of a future Buddha that will come when everyone in the world has forgotten the Dharma. So notice it's Mettañca, and we've said many times before that if we were to break this apart, if this word weren't followed by cha, it would be mettaṃ. And that is the accusative singular feminine that we would expect from metta, being a feminine noun. Now, we won't spend a lot more time defining metta because it is actually spelled out pretty well for us in the next line, as well as spelled out because we know it is a mānasaṃ aparimāṇaṃ. It is a boundless mind. And as in verse 7, when we were told to develop this mind sabbabhutesu, here we are told to develop this mind, this metta, for sabbalokasmi. Now, this is a Kammadharya compound. If we were to break this apart, we would expect sabbasmiṃ lokasmiṃ. This is one of the forms of the locative singular, the masculine and neuter locative singular. Sometimes, and maybe more often, we will simply see loke, but this is probably due to some poetical or metrical exigencies that we are seeing lokasmiṃ. So here, these two words, we are to develop metta in the entire world. That is how it would be if we literally translated the locative. But just as before, we've talked about how the locative might be standing in for another case. So it's possible that the locative here is standing in for the dative. And that would basically be how we would express this in English. Develop metta for the entire world. Now, that's one way to understand it. It is also possible that this is just how it's expressed in Pali. They make use of the locative when we would make use in English of a dative, and we just have to make note of the difference there. Now, on this second line, we get a trio of words that happen very often together. Uddhaṃ, adho, tiriyañca, with a cha thrown in for good measure. Uddhaṃ means above. It's an adverb. Adho, below. Tiriyañca means something like slanting or horizontally or across. So this is expanding upon the idea of sabbalokasmi, the entire world above, under, and across. Now these are a little bit more metaphorical, but this above would refer to any level of existence that would be considered better or superior to the world we live in, the world kind of people, any world of the devas, up to and including the formless realms. Likewise, below would mean the inferior realms, down to and including the hell realms. And then our last two words here, asambādhaṃ and averamasapattaṃ, are expanding upon the mānasaṃ aparimāṇaṃ, or more specifically, Mettañca. So, asambādhaṃ is the opposite of sabbalokasmi. Sabbalokasmi means obstructed, so the opposite of that would be unobstructed, unbound. And that really, I think, refers to not being bound by the idea of the ego, not being bound by greed, anger, delusion, so on and so forth. Just the completely opened mind. And averamasapattaṃ is a compound. It would break apart into averaṃ and asapattaṃ. And as such, it's actually a dvanda compound, meaning that we would actually, in prose, expect averaṃca asapattaṃca. Averaṃ and asapattaṃ. Avera is one of those words that come up quite a bit in Buddhism. And again, it's helpful to think about it as the opposite of vera. So vera would mean something like a hatred or enmity, making avera the opposite of hatred, for which we have a word in English, benevolence. The reason I like to take that approach is because if in English we simply say non-hatred, that doesn't quite get the meaning. It does translate it gives us the etymology of the word we're looking at. It tells us how it's formed. But we have to keep in mind that this avera is the opposite of vera. And in English, when we say non-hatred, that doesn't mean the opposite of hatred. It could just mean some neutral place where hatred doesn't exist, but benevolence possibly hasn't blossomed. And then lastly, but not leastly, asapattaṃ. This would be the opposite of sapattaṃ. Now, sapattaṃ means hostile. So asapattaṃ would mean not hostile, not contentious, not aggressive. So this is quite a wonderful and beautiful picture or understanding of metta. I mean, it's really spelled out well for us here. If you haven't seen it already, the daily Pali reading dealing with the Metta Sutta might be of interest to you. I'll put a little screenshot up here and a link in the description. And of course, it's worth pointing out, if we haven't already, that this idea comes up in many different traditions. In Christianity, we have agape. In Hinduism, we have this idea of bhakti or spiritual devotion. And it is a characteristic of Taoism. I'm going to put the Chinese character up here, pronounce something like ch, but keep in mind, I don't know Chinese, and I certainly cannot pronounce it well at all. This character has to do with the ideas of being compassionate and gentle, merciful, kind, and humane. And notice finally here that this is not offered to us as something that we need to blindly believe in. It is something we need to take hold of and practice, and we can start to feel the power of metta. And the power is perhaps a little anti-intuitive, but it is powerful when we start to take our ego out of the equation and we start to find that we can live in the world in a non-aggressive, way, in a benevolent way, in a way where our mind is open and compassionate.